and intriguing to play in are the dark, the mysterious, and the macabre elements that keep us coming back for more. Today on Desks and Dorks, we're going to be talking about the little things that make fantasy terrifying. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, I am the Dork, and that makes you fine folks at the desk. And you're watching Desks and Dorks. We bring you indie tabletop role-playing content. Today we're going to be doing something special. As many of you know, I was trained to be a medievalist. I have a medieval history degree, and I love bringing in real historical perspectives in the role-playing games I design through Desks and Dorks and in the games that I run and play with my friends. Today we're going to be talking about the overlooked details of the medieval world and how those tie into some of the best elements of fantasy. We'll be looking at the stuff that gets overlooked though, but is truly terrifying, truly scary. We're going to talk about how to use them in our games, and lastly, you, me, the comment section, together through this video, we are going to build our own fantasy kingdom that is going to take a lot of the lessons that we have learned. And I think we have to start off with the understanding and the idea that the Middle Ages as a backdrop for fantasy role-playing is, I think, often underutilized or at least poorly misunderstood. There are a lot of misconceptions about how the people of the past lived, and to help that, I have separated this video not just into segments about the kingdom that we will make, but the misconceptions that we will correct along the way. And if you'd like to skip around, you're more than welcome to. The timestamps are found in the description below. With that out of the way, let's get rocking, and let's start talking about our kingdom, which is, of course, the Kingdom of Telanon. Telanon is a land that is dominated both by the pine forests that sweep across its landscape, as well as the superstition that these moss-covered havens tend to inspire. Its folk are hardy and hard-working trappers, rangers, and frontier folk who eke out a living by hunting and, again, trapping and fishing what they can, and also attempting to survive some of Telanon's more hostile flora and fauna, shall we say. It is a land of superstition and wilderness, a land where individual talent and strength will get you far, but where breaking the means and importance of the community could spell your untimely demise. It's a place where new beliefs, or modern in the context of our world, come to clash with the traditions of the folk who originally settled there. And it's important to establish that backdrop before we start talking about our first misconception, and that is that religion is homogenous. In the Middle Ages, there's this shall we say, wrong impression that Catholicism is a monolith, particularly in the Middle Ages, where it's just one big unified religious force that tends to dominate everything. And again, while Catholicism, and to a greater extent Islam, was a big deal in the Middle Ages, to call it a monolith, to say it's homogenous, is in fact grossly wrong. In reality, it's a patchwork of beliefs, of ideas, of customs, and the type of religion that is practiced in the Middle Ages, and I would argue in fantasy worlds inspired by them, should be as different, or should have different themes or different things that they hold of great importance to the main line or main branch of any theology. Let's talk a little bit about that idea, because what we call that is folk religion. And while folk religion is an umbrella term for all of the different things that make or change how a mainline religion functions in different places within a kingdom, there's a couple really cool examples of this. Many of them tend to stem from local myths and legend. It wasn't uncommon in some small villages and places to have their own unique creatures of myth and have those take on important roles within biblical tales or within even established faith doctrines. Many villages would have a patron or a local saint, someone that they believed they had a bond with, someone that might have even come from that individual area, and as such played massive roles in the lives of those medieval peasants. In many cases, they would actually turn to that patron saint as an advocate in the eyes of God, and over time it would develop into its own almost cult-like religion, and in some cases actually a cult-like religion. This is also objectively true for other things. A individual leader might change the tenor and shape of faith in their region. For example, if you look at the Italian cardinals, particularly the Medici, the Sforza, and the Borgia, that's going to greatly change how Catholicism and religious rites are interpreted and used within those places. And charismatic faith leaders in small, out-of-the-way areas could wield a great tremendous amount of influence at changing how faith is interpreted and how religion is used within those spaces. Another thing to take into account is that interfaith conflict over seemingly small details is common in the Middle Ages, right? Many of you might be familiar with something called the Council of Nicaea, which has to deal with differences in the Catholic faith. And in some cases, those differences came to blows. And even after a peace treaty is inked, within that cultural memory, there is going to be bad blood. And that bad blood might mean that you, somebody who has a single belief system, treats somebody with a similar belief system as an enemy rather than a friend, despite the fact that you have common ground, and it stems from those differences in tradition. This can be true of people like the Byzantine Catholics, who might practice things wildly differently than the Cathars, who all of course would come to blows with one another. I think it's important to address this now, because the one thing that drives me nuts when I'm playing a fantasy game, particularly one where holy magic is involved, is that they don't treat it as numerous traditions under an overarching umbrella rather than just a monolith to be interacted with. Humans are really different. The way that we interact with one another is really different. And as such, my interpretation and your interpretation of the very same faith concept is going to be wildly different. And it's going to change based on how things go. Let's take the pagan festivals of real-life history, for example, right? These were incredibly important to the people in the times of pre-Christianity. So much so, in fact, that one of the most effective ways to evangelize people within those spaces was to co-opt important pagan holidays and replace them with standard religious ones. You might be familiar, perhaps, with the festival of Sol Invictus. I mean, who isn't familiar with Sol Invictus, right? That pagan Roman rite where we honor the sun god, where we, go through the zenith of this time period, where we welcome in a new changing of the stars. Come on, you absolutely know the festival of Sol Invictus, right? One of the most important Roman rites that was itself co-opted from and changed by local customs of many of the peoples the Romans subjugated. It's known by everybody, right? Well, actually, fun fact, you might not know or be familiar with Sol Invictus, but you are familiar with the date that it takes place on, because it actually takes place on December 31st, which is when we celebrate Christmas. And that's not an accident, right? This was a local, important custom that was co-opted by the Romans and later was taken, twisted, and changed to better fit the dominant religion in the form of Christianity. This is a good example of the kinds of ways that folk religion, even if we're not aware of it, creep its way into even monolithic seeming religious and cultural forces. And it's just one example of the kind of pagan history and early, cultural practices that have crept their way into other religions. And another one that I think is really interesting, at least I find interesting in the modern era, is that Catholicism and voodoo in Haiti are incredibly linked. If you want to look at how folk tradition and how established religious practices might be changed and morphed over time, there is a massive difference between Catholic belief in Haiti and Catholic belief in other places in the world. One of the coolest ones is that many of the, I don't want to call them, I guess they are deities technically, many of the deities within voodoo practice are actually interpolated and slightly changed to be Catholic saints. In some cases, they are both, depending on the person that you talk to, and in other cases, they play important roles in each religion. It's a really cool rabbit hole to go on, and one that shows that folk religion is still prominent and still important even today. And one of my favorite examples of this on the topic of saints being changed are the saint cults that I alluded to earlier. There are in fact dozens of saint cults that exist throughout the Middle Ages. These were incredibly popular in fringe or rural areas where a given saint, which in Catholic parlance is supposed to serve as an advocate for a person, an advocate to present their petitions to the Lord, right, to God. They believed that, hey, if a saint makes it to heaven, if somebody was capable of doing miracles in life, they're probably able to put in a word for the big guy upstairs for me. And over time, the important relationship that those people had with the saints became full-blown worship, in many cases having to be put down or at the very least smothered bureaucratically by the established Catholic Church or secular authorities. And again, it just goes to show how interesting and how intriguing this can be when you approach faith as not a monolith, but as a patchwork quilt of the weird, the strange, and in some cases, the terrifying. We didn't even touch on this yet, but grave robbing and relic thieving were two of the most prominent things that happened in those rural areas that had saint cults, with many people either owning or claiming to own the bones or other decomposing flesh, in some cases, of a former saint. It's absolutely wild, the kind of stuff that those peasants got up to, and it just kind of goes to show that folk religion can be a very interesting and evocative concept to make your world come to life. And let's talk a little bit about Telanon's strange faith. I alluded earlier in this video to Telanon's weird and in some cases deadly flora and fauna. This is an ancient forest, a strange forest, and it is one that, although its people are very strong and very fierce, it is one that still holds on to its wildness. There are spirits in those woods that take on the form of animals, people, trees, and in some cases, wild amalgamations of all of those things. And it is those ancient forces that the people of Telanon originally worshipped. They made them a part of their rites. They carried their spirits with them in many ways, like minor deities, or in some cases, like trusted family or ancestral friends. But however, it was viewed as a larger point, death being a simple part of the natural world. This is a religion focused on the end, on the demise of somebody, the final unalivement, the return to the cosmic lobby, if you will. But again, it's not these things as a negative. It's just the simplicity of the idea that eventually we all have to meet our final finish line. And that's really what the faith was centered on, or was centered on, before Telanon was invaded. Over a series of years in the ancient times, the people of what is now a fully functioning collection of kingdoms waged war on what would become Telanon, and in doing so, managed to take out a great deal of their defenders, their leaders, and in some cases, the members of their faith. Through military conquest, economic pressure, and bureaucratic systems, eventually, Telanon was absorbed into the greater kingdom, made and named as it stands now, and its original faith was suppressed. In some cases, though, the locals were able to fight back, maintaining their original cultural practices and religious rites at the expense of those who invaded them, and in some cases, those regions of Telanon were either not economically worth it, or certainly not able to be assailed through traditional means, and those people, viewed as backwards by their conquerors, were allowed to exist in, shall we say, relative religious freedom. Siege after siege, however, has continued to wear those places down, even into the modern era, and as a result, the established Church of the Sun is the dominant religion in Telanon, the culturally accepted religion. It's an important one for us to address because in addition to many of its central tenets, one of the ones that it thinks of, or at least sees, is the idea of an eternal life after the one that those people are in. If you live a faithful life as a supplicant of the sun, you will be reborn into the next world, pure and glowing. And this is interesting because that concept of resurrection combines with the idea of death being a natural part of life to realize that maybe the end truly isn't the end. And over time, something called the Grove Faith begins to rear its head. The Grove Faith is focused on the idea of resurrection of a kind, but not being reborn into a new world, but to being reborn into the natural one, perhaps as a spirit, perhaps as an actual tree itself, or as some sort of other guardian. The members of the Grove Faith will meet in groves. Circles of trees are preferred, but a simple circle of candles can also serve as a quote-unquote grove with which the religious rites can be performed. These are a combination of both the Church of the Sun as well as those original folk religious practices, and that circle, the circle of the grove, becomes a hidden symbol of the faith, right? The circle of the grove representing both those trees, but also the cyclical nature of death and rebirth in the world of Telanon, right? Follow the Grove Faith, continue the rites, honor the sun, but also don't forget that there is importance, faith, and power in the darkness that leaves behind when the sun goes out. This is really important because even though there is an established religion, the Grove faith is massively popular amongst the citizens of this kingdom. So much so that these religious rites, viewed as punishable by secular authorities, often take place in broad daylight, or in some cases broad nightlight via bonfire, without anyone even caring. Now, again, reincarnation into the natural world is the main focus of this. A circle of trees, a circle of candles, a circle of life, death, and rebirth. That's really what the Grove faith is going for. And again, they really do genuinely believe that through faith works, they can be reborn into the world that they have called their home for so long. Ideal supplicants wish to be reborn as a kind of living tree, not necessarily a dryad, but a spirit within the oak, one that will grow a wall of trees around their original home or village, continuing a vigil over their friends and family. Some wish to become hermit spirits, those that continue to spread the wisdom of the Grove faith even long after their death, taking on disciples and scrawling prophecies onto the tree bark. But from a gameplay perspective, right, it's a focus on whether or not they're going to follow the old faith, the new faith, or the Grove faith. And if you want to set a game in Telanon, I genuinely believe that you have to have 3 different options for a priest or somebody practicing magic that comes from a religious force. And again, those are you going to follow the original faith of this kingdom, the new faith of the sun god, or the combined version of those things, the folk religion that is the Grove faith? For those in the new faith, right, the idea of resurrection, of cleansing, comes in the ability to cleanse water and remove toxins from liquid once per day. Doesn't matter if those toxins are magical in nature, or if they're naturally occurring, or even if they're poison, but once per day, you can actually manage to restore a bunch of toxin out of the water, make it safe to drink. This means that followers of the new faith are incredibly in high demand in Telanon, for reasons that you'll find out a little bit later in the video. Members of the old faith, those that follow the tradition of dark paths and the individuals that chose to tread on them, can always ascertain true north and are always able to determine if a path is safe to travel from environmental hazards. That's actually really important, as well as from mythical hazards. So if a monster, a magically enhanced being of some great power, is on a path ahead, they'll know about it. However, the ambushes of man, well, they're pretty vulnerable to those, and I kind of like that as a concept, right? These priests were able to figure out the magic and the mythos in the world around them, but they were unable to stop the very human conquerors that forced their religion into the shadows in the first place. And the Grove faith, with its emphasis on the cycle of life and death, is able to do 2 different things. They can offer death for life, sacrificing something small to help stymie or completely cure a disease, or offer life for death, in some cases letting part of their own blood out and then being able to give a disease or illness to somebody else. The severity of that illness being dependent on the amount of hemoglobin lost in this transaction. In this way, I think the priests of the Grove faith continue to exemplify the kind of circle that we're really talking about. And speaking of talking, let's talk about the misconception number 2 that I think people always miss in a fantasy world, one based on the Middle Ages at least, and that's that the biggest threats were violence. There is this image, right, of battle, of conquest, but really disease, malnutrition, and bad drinking water were your biggest ops. Now here's the thing, we tend to conjure pictures of battles, of conquest, of armies clashing, of knights falling upon their own swords, or taking out hundreds of their enemies with a battle axe in hand. And as evocative and interesting as those are, as hard as pieces of art like these go, the truth of the matter is you are far more able to get unalived by a bunch of squiggly boys or an empty belly than you were by someone with a sword. The picture I'm showing you right now are skulls recovered from medieval dig sites throughout Europe. One of the things that you might have noticed is the teeth, and particularly the jaws themselves, look a little bit different than you might be used to if you're familiar with skeletons at all. And one of the things that they think, actually not even think, one of the things they've proven because of these bone structures is that many people suffered from drastic amounts of malnutrition, not getting enough or getting just enough to stay stable, but not enough to truly sustain you was one of the big reasons for the weak immune systems, the low age of living, and in some cases even the infant mortality rates in the Middle Ages. And nutrition kind of mattered for all of it, and it was really critically important. And there's a number of reasons why you might not be able to get the nutrition that you need. In some places, a lack of arable land was to blame. Agriculture just could not keep up in some cases with the booming populations, or in some cases where people chose to settle in ways that would allow everyone to get fed. Similarly, it was really difficult to grow nutrient diverse crops in many of these cases, and obviously there's a couple of different agricultural innovations that occur in the middle of the Middle Ages, which is kind of funny, that really pave the way. Things like cycle farming, where you actually leave some fields fallow or plant crops that aren't necessarily super valuable or particularly desirable, but whose planting actually creates nutrients in the soil, innovations in different types of plows, and even changes in the climate. There's a massive warming that goes on during the Middle Ages, although this one is not nearly as man-made as the one that we are currently going over, but that helps to loosen the soil and increase agricultural output. But for many years, and before a lot of those innovations came to be, many people struggled to get enough to eat. And similarly, while direct conflict and violence might not necessarily be the main core cause, one of the big issues is that if you wanted to starve out an opposing army, that starve out part is literal. You'll burn the fields, you'll torch the granaries, you'll take out the farmers, and everybody, not just the army, is the one that suffers. That's kind of a huge deal here, particularly when there aren't exactly things like fire departments around to help deal with blazes or the destruction of an oncoming enemy force. Disease is similarly part of the problem. A lack of understanding of disease is part of this, as well as a shall we say, not forbidden, but a emphasis on Christian-based knowledge. A lot of the Muslim world was kind of dunking on, the whole idea of diseases at this time period, and we were kind of falling behind in terms of innovations in that area, and it really starts to show in the Middle Ages, but particularly it shows when we talk about drinking water. One of the big issues with bad drinking water or contaminated, polluted drinking water is obviously you need water to stay alive, but oh boy, if you drink the wrong kind of water, it is like a horrid reset button on your body's immune system. This is one of the reasons that beer, in some cases, was so critically important in the Middle Ages, and I think part of the reason that beer, taverns, and the idea of alcohol in a fantasy setting at all has continued to persist in the modern imagination, right? Not only was the brewing process capable of wiping out many of the microbes that would cause those horrible diseases like cholera, but in many cases, beer could be used as a nutritional stopgap in cases where you needed it. It's kind of like a ye old protein shake, and I think that's really awesome. And it actually paves the way to Telanon's issues that are going to continue to plague the people that live there. One of them is a lack of arable land. As we discussed earlier, if you don't have land to farm, it's going to make farming pretty hard. And in Telanon's case, it's not just that there isn't arable land, there probably would be if they could ever get past those pesky forests. And one of the reasons that getting past those pesky forests is so hard is that they are still riddled with all manner of creatures who like to live there, in addition to the humans that still defend their traditional home. This is a big issue because if you want to clear out lands for fields, you're going to have to deal not just with the standard issues of logging, but with monsters that are able to deck you like a 4,000-pound tree trunk having a baby with Rocky Balboa. It's kind of a problem, and in order to make these stopgaps, people have taken on to doing a couple of different things to try to make ends meet nutritionally. Pine needle or needle tea is common in Telanon. It's one of the most standard issue drinks, and other than beer, is the most standard drink that you can find. And some folks, if they can't or are unable to afford the equipment to brew the tea, will just stick to steeping cold needles in whatever water they can find or chewing the needles themselves. Similarly, and this is something that actually I didn't even realize until I did this video, did happen and does still happen in some areas where nutrition is hard to come by. The people people of Telanon will make pine bark bread, taking the fibers from the inside of pine trees, basically treating them in water or soaking them in water to soften them up, grinding them into a kind of flour, and then making this very rough, unleavened, and frankly speaking, not exactly calorically dense bread as a way to try to meet the demands of living in a place like this, where food is just so scarce. And in some cases, the people of this place have their mouths stained green and brown by chewing on pine needles, by trying to make ends meet for themselves nutritionally in any way that they can. This is such a big phenomenon in Telanon that being called a needle eater is essentially the colloquial term for being dirt poor. But the people of Telanon are hardworking. They're not going to take that exactly lying down. And so, in the face of their poverty and the struggles that it brings, they send their sons and daughters out into the waking world to find a trade. And they find that they're actually quite skilled smiths. You see, clearing an entire forest or a grove might, arouse the anger of the spirits or the guardians of the grove faith. But you can take down a couple branches, you could take down a tree or two to stoke your forge, and you'll be relatively fine. And so for many of the Telonites, becoming a smith of some kind is a path to economic freedom, and it comes with a couple prices though. First and foremost, the industrial sludge, the slurry from those forges, fills the rivers, and it compounds a lot of the problems that they're having. In addition to having caloric deficits and a struggle to feed themselves, now more and more Telonites are getting sick from bad water. But it's not going to make you sick? Our sponsor today, and our sponsor is us. It's Desks and Dorks. I'm sponsoring my own video. Why the heck not? If you have gotten this far into the video, why not give us a like, a share, a comment, a subscribe? You could hype us if you're on mobile, because apparently that's the new thing that YouTube really wants right now, and will probably want for the next month until they change it and make something else that's new. But seriously, if you like what we do here, all of the YouTube stuff would really go quite a long way. You can, of course, follow that QR code or link in the description below if you want PDF copies of any of the RPGs that we make. And for $10 a month, you can join our Patreon. This is usually where I tell you that we make a unique role-playing game every single month for our patrons, but that's actually going to be changing. And if you're curious about the changes to the Patreon, then I would highly encourage you to check out the end of the video. I'm going to be explaining a little bit how that is going to work. But lastly, thank you so much just for watching. It really does mean a lot. And that brings us to misconception number 3, which is that crime was rampant and that punishment for said crime was non-existent. And the reality is that formal lawmaking doesn't really exist during the Middle Ages, or at least doesn't exist in parts of the Middle Ages, and is more haphazard than one might expect. But communal law enforcement and communal penal enforcement did exist, and it actually was important. It helped to govern certain practices. So one of the clearest examples of this are the shire reeves, which, if you're saying shire reeve, sheriff, that's actually where we get the term sheriff from. But the shire reeve was a sometimes armed, sometimes not, official that would move around and sort of help lesser lords and help at the behest of the monarch to maintain and to enforce the codes and laws of the kingdom. This was a really important position, particularly in Saxon times, because courts tended to be a little bit more mobile, or if they weren't mobile, tended to really just sort of sequester themselves in one fortress area in order to protect their ruler. And this meant that the shire reeve, who was continually moving around the area, was essential to carrying out the king's justice. There were also, in addition to shire reeves, some individuals took it upon themselves or were deputized by their local lord to protect the surrounding areas. Now, this is where some abuses of power come into play, and if you're curious about how those worked or what might happen to a town guard that is community funded, we did an entire video about making a better town guard that I'm going to shamelessly self-plug here, because it goes into greater detail about what those types of policing might look like. However, what's really interesting, though, at least for me, is that because these systems were regionally enforced rather than nationally enforced, they tended to be really inconsistent, but they do exist, right? When communities do not have the support of a central government when it comes to enforcing or creating laws, they will go about meeting those needs on their own. And in some cases, it was far more lenient and far more progressive, and in some cases, it was far more draconian and punitive. It just depends on where you're going to be. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was studying capital punishment was a study that came out from Harvard. Harvard Law specifically, looked at how the penal codes were enforced throughout the Middle Ages and what that might particularly look like. And the one thing that they found is that right around the times of the 13th century, if you made it to trial, odds are you were never going to face punishment. And that's because there was a number of different ways a person could weasel their way out. They could join the clergy, for example, or claim sanctuary within a church. They could just flee the town and literally wait for things to blow over. It's not just for 70s crime movies. It apparently works in fantasy and in the Middle Ages as well. You see, justice in Telanon has evolved over the centuries and has turned into something that's a little bit different depending on where you go within the kingdom's borders. Early on, criminals were just sent out into the wilderness with the hope that those living in it, the spirits, the monsters, the creatures, the flora, the fauna, would be the ones to dispose of them. But as time went on and as people realized, hey, they'd much rather risk, a secular court than the wrath of those monsters, pine justice, as it has been known, starts to go by the wayside. And in the intervening years, sheriffs of many different types and sizes, of shapes and stripes, have become, part and parcel with law enforcement within Telanon's borders, traveling around from town to town, usually a couple towns in their vicinity, with a retinue of their own, and handling cases as they need to. However, in those moments where there aren't a sheriff around or their retinue, the people of Telanon tend to take matters into their own hands, particularly when it comes to matters like food theft or destroying usable food within its borders. It's a big crime when everyone is struggling to get by, and those individuals call themselves glade guards. Whether they are the appointed sheriff or the people taking the law into their own hands, they call themselves glade guards. Kind of an important thing. However, this practice of being a glade guard, of carrying out pine justice, essentially leaving people out into the wilderness to be destroyed or consumed, has been essentially slowly tamped down. At least that's what the other people in the other kingdoms think. In reality, however, the practice has simply continued behind closed doors, or when they know that no one is going to come looking. Now, in Telanon, there's a couple different individuals. We talked about glade guards, but there are two groups I want to highlight here that I think are helpful. One is the glade breakers. These individuals were originally lumberjacks. However, they realized within the sort of gameplay environment that we're creating that there's far easier tasks than trying to go after those cursed trees. Why not actually just go after individuals deemed criminal by the communities around them? And they cause grievous wounds with those axes. Wounds caused by these individuals are going to have a rate of healing that's actually half of the usual rate, magical or otherwise, which I think is kind of cool. And if you're watching our thumbnail, you may have been drawn in by this picture, and that is Our Lady of Pain. I wanted to combine a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, and I combined the idea of a saint cult and this sort of not frontier justice, but communal-based judgment with this group. The Lady of Pain is a nun, or was a nun, of the Church of the Sun. A sun nun. She's been, however, possessed by a forest spirit. Unlike a full possession, however, both she and the spirit share the body, and they have the chance to converse with one another. And over time, they realize they have far more in common than they first believed, and because of that, these two actually decide that they're going to bring the gift of possession onto others. They call these forest baptisms, and that's the punishment for the crimes that other people commit. They're basically hoping that individuals will be consumed by the spirit, and rather than being destroyed, will undergo a half possession like the lady herself. And in many ways, she sees this as an extrapolation of the cycle of life, of the end, and of rebirth. And I think that's kind of important. And ultimately, this change and this shift can bring about individuals of great power who can assist the lady in her mission. And with that, my friends, it brings us to the end of today's video. I have to say thank you to our many patrons: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Kavadi, Alex.vksh, Solution, Stefan Brousseau, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mare, Darth, Arcane Bard, Commander Unidentified, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Carl Aetius, David Z, Michael Torres, Talath, and Veralder. You are all absolutely amazing. And to my YouTube patrons, Ro.kn, Agile Monk, Joshua Williams, Green, Artemis, Samuel Putnam, Seralder, Chandler Dwyer, Hatsis, Up, Up, Down, Down, Left, Right, Sir Goldsmith, Jakob, Krebo, Tebby, Raymond Jang, Brody Stumpf, Ryan D, Thunderdash, and Gaming Gambison. You are all absolutely amazing. And if you've stuck it out, I want to talk a little bit about how Patreon is going to be changing. Now, traditionally, on our Patreon, it's $10 a month. You get your own unique role-playing game. However, we wanted to change that. I had a couple people actually suggest and ask very politely if they was some way they could get the earlier Patreon role-playing games, of which there are about 8 in total so far, and we'd like to continue that forward, right? And I talked it over with the patrons because they backed with the understanding there was going to be exclusivity. And basically unanimously, actually entirely unanimously, the $10 patrons voted. Shout out to them. They're the GOATs. And if you join the Patreon, you will have them to thank because they voted to make all of the previous games available to $10 patrons moving forward. I'm going to kind of work out a new system where if you join, there is going to still be some exclusivity benefits because I really do want to reward those who have been longtime fans. I'm not sure if it's going to be discounts on existing Desks and Dorks role-playing games that are already in retail. I'm exploring what I think is going to be a season model where you get the season of RPGs, the 12 RPGs of the year that you join, if you stick it out for that year, and then you get the one behind that. I'm not sure what we're going to do. But again, if you want to get involved in the Desks and Dorks community and you're like, well, I don't really want to get involved, I'm not sure the value is there, you're getting essentially all of the games from the previous months. And as long as you continue to be a patron, you'll get the new one that comes out every month as well. A huge shout out both to the community members that asked for this because they're like, hey, I really want to take part in the community, but I want to play the rest of the games that you've made. And a massive thank you to the generosity of the $10 patrons who said, nah, forget exclusivity, man. If we can get more people to try the stuff that Desks and Dorks makes, let's do it. So they're absolutely amazing, and I have to thank them. And by the way, folks, if you are still watching, you are absolutely amazing. I'm Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.